House of Games?
Hello, everyone. I'm going to start with a little linguistic puzzle.
Oh, yeah.
Is it wriggle room or is it wiggle room?
Wriggle.
I'm a wriggler.
Wriggle.
As well.
Are you?
I mean linguistically, not physically while you're waiting to go on TV.
I think it's wiggle, but I say wriggle because I think language has evolved here. But I think you can wriggle in the wiggle room.
So it's a wiggle room for wriggling.
Yes.
What is it? So
From my research on the internet, so
That's
not
always
necessarily
reliable.
trustworthy. I haven't confirmed with the House of Commons library. Both are acceptable, but wiggle room is the more commonly used one.
Is it?
Yeah.
So what's the difference in the dictionary definition between a
I don't think there is a difference.
I think so. Wriggling would be the action of
a wiggle.
Squirming.
Yeah.
Squirming? Kind of wriggling, squirming.
Yeah. But
because you wouldn't say so he wiggled, would
yes,
you?
yes,
But you would
exactly.
say he
He
wriggled.
wriggled.
Yeah.
I don't. Yes, exactly.
I think I prefer wriggle room because it's got that little alliteration of the R.
Yes. It's
I
the
think it because it is more evocative in terms of what they're actually doing. Like, is there space to wriggle in there, in your wriggle room?
But then I suppose that's the action of wriggling as opposed to the...
Anyway, the reason it's come up is because it was a big theme of the spring statement on Wednesday, wasn't it? Just how much kind of a buffer has Rachel Reeves left herself to meet her own fiscal rules. That's why we're talking about it, not because we've become an episode of Poetry Please on Radio 4. This is an episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it's Chris in the studio.
And it's Alex in the studio.
And Faisal too in the studio.
And we did a big, long, live episode of Newscast on Wednesday, which you could watch on YouTube, where we were crunching over the spring statement. And Faisal, you and I were joking about, some of the economists and observers are saying, this might not even last a week because next week Donald Trump is going to decide what tariffs to put on everyone. And the Office of Budget Responsibility say that could wipe out Rachel Reeves' plans. And then you said, no, he's actually about to announce some new tariffs on the import of cars. And we joked, it hasn't even lasted a day. So just bring us up to date with what Donald Trump has done.
I ran downstairs. We turned on, and it's becoming a bit of a ritual for us when we do the 10 o'clock news now. It's like roughly 9 o'clock. It's roughly 4 or 5 o'clock Washington time, and you wait and you see what's he going to say.
Actually, let's listen to it now. This is what happened then.
We're going to charge countries for doing business in our country and taking our jobs, taking our wealth, taking a lot of things that they've been taking over the years. They've taken so much out of our country, friend and foe, and frankly, friend has been oftentimes much worse than foe. And this is very modest. And what we're going to be doing is a 25% tariff on all cars that are not made in the United States. If they're made in the United States, there's absolutely no tariff.
That's obviously is what it says on the tin. There was no exemptions or exceptions. It had been raised by the British government that maybe there could be an exemption, not just the UK government, Japanese government, loads of other governments, and blanket all car imports. And so, suddenly one of the materials we talked about yesterday on the live streamed show, which was actually mentioned by the OBR, which was that you'd have a much bigger potential trade war with retaliation, was starting to become material. To be clear, this on its own, it wouldn't send the UK into recession, wouldn't wipe away the wiggle room, but this is the start. This is a massive industry that is almost the epitome of world trade, that for the UK, it is our single biggest export to the US. And by the way, the other industry he mentioned as in line for tariffs was pharmaceuticals, which is number 2 in terms of our exports to the US. So although it's not aimed at the UK and negotiations are still ongoing, as I said yesterday, there was a lot of optimism that we were going to have this deal done this week. It's all been thrown up in the air, and it could well affect, if it gets worse, it's the sort of thing that definitely sort of wipes out, lowers your headroom and maybe makes those numbers out of date just as they're freshly printed on the page.
And Alex, it's interesting because if you look at European leaders, they're saying we must retaliate. They're not saying this is war, but they're getting pretty close. Whereas the UK are just relying on what Faisal was just talking about there. Oh no, we're going to do a deal with the US so that this doesn't become a problem for us. There's no like fight back from Rachel Reeves or Keir Starmer.
Almost like directly the opposite, because they keep using this phrase about cool heads and keep cool heads, and they have from the very beginning. Clearly because they don't want to do anything that could potentially antagonise the White House, but also because I think there is still a sense of genuine hope that the UK, from their perspective, could be in a bit of a special carve-out position, because they feel like a lot of Donald Trump's ire is directed more towards the EU than the UK. And even though he quite often uses the phrase European, and so the UK, of course, is part of Europe in terms of trade and the rest of it, the blocks are separate. So I think they're still kind of hoping, there's an optimism that they might be able to do something that says, remember, you like us. Remember, we're the UK. Remember, we haven't got a big trade deficit with you in the same way some of the other countries have. So actually, perhaps you can just do us a deal. And there are conversations ongoing about it, but those conversations are tricky and they might require trade-offs, and they might require the UK to give something to the US or the tech firms or something else that won't be entirely comfortable. But they are being so cautious, I think, not to try and provoke or antagonise in the hope of escaping or ducking some of the tariffs. Although I don't know how realistic that prospect actually is.
Well, do we know how well those negotiations are going? Because, I mean, Rachel Reeves was kind of relying on them going pretty well a lot when she was doing her interviews and media around the spring statement.
It is... The Jenga analogy is absolutely spot on for this, because what you could do, and I've heard all sorts of things, like the Japanese, they're in a much better place in a way to get an exemption because it's zero tariffs for them. So they go, hang on, why are you going to do this to us? So we could do that.
Oh, because we have a 10% tariff on 10% American
tariff
cars
on
coming
US,
in here.
but not a lot of US cars. And this is the dirty secret here. It isn't tariffs that are stopping Europeans driving US cars. It's the fact that Europeans don't like driving US
Chevys.
cars because they're too big. It's an aesthetic thing. It's part of the culture. There is one company that's an exception to that. We'll get onto that in a second. But if you were to do that, so say the thought process is, and I think it is being considered in Europe to lower the tariff, then you, in theory, because of the World Trade Organization rules, you've got to offer that to everybody else, including China. You're like, well, China, thank you very much.
Right.
We'll export our complete kind of literal army of cheap and highly efficient, and they can charge in 5 minutes now, electric vehicles into the UK with the same tariff that you've now lowered. So it's an extremely difficult game of trade Jenga. And so it's a lot easier said than done. And so I think it's looking a bit trickier now, that all those trade-offs, not to mention what the domestic political fallout could be if they go, how far are they willing to go with that contrast with the other Europeans and the Canadians?
And this is the fascinating thing, isn't it? So we are, 2 months and a little bit in to Donald Trump's second term, and this strategy from the UK government of not doing commentary and trying to dial things down publicly.
If in doubt, say nout, I believe you've classified
that's the label I've attached to it.
It works better in a Yorkshire accent.
But how long does if in doubt, say nout fly for when you are confronted by things that you feel you have to oppose? Now, we had an example of this in terms of language, when there was those remarks from J.D. Vance, in the US Vice President, in that Fox News interview of 5 or 6 weeks ago, that the Prime Minister found a vehicle for responding to in terms of UK troops in Iraq and Afghanistan and the contribution to those conflicts, with the marking of the anniversaries of the deaths of some soldiers at the start of Prime Minister's questions. He responded with an action rather than a commentary. But in a scenario around tariffs, particularly if on the other side of the quote-unquote Liberation Day, as the president calls it, next week, with the suggestion of widespread tariffs on all sorts of different countries across all sorts of different sectors, at what point does saying nothing or making warm noises just no longer fly, either in a practical policy sense or in a domestic political sense, when the polls suggest that Donald Trump, irrespective of somebody in the UK's domestic political views, for the vast majority, is not wildly popular.
And in a weird way, is this kind of helpful to Rachel Reeves? Because I really thought, listening to the spring statement on Wednesday, that it was going to be a big speech about the world has changed. These are all the threats. She's going to list all the threats and all the things that had changed. But actually, there was only about 2 sentences of that. And then it was on to like the classic fiscal stuff. I just wonder if this helps reinforce her message, which that bit of it got a bit lost yesterday, I thought.
I think it's helpful to the thesis, but not helpful to the numbers. It allows them to make the argument about the world change. I mean, when Faisal and I were on the 10 o'clock news last night, just after Donald Trump had done the whole thing about cars, we were talking about, oh, look at this, and then of course, oh, that is a case study in exactly the argument that Rachel Reeves is making. But on the numbers, if these things start biting, and we know how little wriggle room there is, then that wiggles to nothing, doesn't it? Or worse than nothing from her perspective.
Yeah, because didn't the Office for Budget Responsibility say their projection for economic growth in the UK this year is 1%? And then a few paragraphs down, they say that if Trump does the biggest tariffs he's likely to do on everyone, that reduces economic growth in the UK by 1%.
Yeah, and everyone retaliates.
And
those are lots of caveats there to that 1%.
But it is worth
figure.
noting in the press statement, background statement that the White House put out yesterday, it did say that mega tariff, unilateral, 10% was a great idea. And here's some obscure economic research that proves that. There isn't any really credible research that proves that. There was one thing that Rachel Reeves said this morning, speaking to Today, that I thought was quite interesting. She was pressed by Nick Robinson on that issue of why we subsidise Tesla, whether you could, this is a backdoor. We don't.
Is that some leverage, in other words?
Well, so the Canadians, and I keep on going on. Canadians have quietly pulled all their subsidies for Tesla EVs at the state level, and Elon Musk will have noticed that they make actually almost as much money out of this than out of cars. Really interesting. And she said that this ZEV mandate that we've covered before, they're already looking at it, but she straight away picked up this idea that we aren't going to punish people that make cars in the UK and then get them essentially to pay fines which go to electric vehicle importers. The net result of this could be quite interesting. So I understand that there's a meeting with ministers tomorrow morning with the car manufacturers. Some are optimistic this means that there's a deal. I'm not so sure. I think they may also be preparing what support they're going to ask for if this goes through. And this may be one of the asks. Tweak this ZEV mandate. Don't make us that make cars in Britain and export them from here write a check to the likes of Tesla.
Now, not to turn this into Chris and Faisal's tour of the TV studios from Wednesday, but when I was watching you two with Joe Coburn on Politics Live on BBC Two, either side of the spring statement, you did your analysis, and then Darren Jones, the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, came in, and he used quite a powerful analogy for his take on how the Office for Budget Responsibility had calculated the costs or the savings or the effects of the changes to disability benefits. And then when he was on Robert Peston's show on ITV a few hours later, he had to sort of eat some metaphorical humble pie. Here's how it played out.
If I said to my kids, I'm going to cut your pocket money by £10 a week, but you have to go and get a Saturday job, the impact assessment on that basis would say that my kids were down £10, irrespective of how much money they get from their Saturday job.
Pretty tactless to say this was the equivalent of taking a bit of pocket money away from your children who might get a Saturday job. Do you want to sort of basically address those people who feel a bit hurt by that?
Yeah, I'm sorry about it. It was tactless and it wasn't well considered. What I was trying to explain in simple terms was what the impact assessment considers and what it doesn't consider. The impact assessment considers how much money you lose by coming off of the social security system, but it doesn't consider how much money you gain by being back in work. I should have used a different set of words to explain it. I recognise that wasn't good enough and I apologise if I've offended people.
And as apologies go, Alex, that was A, quite big, and B, very fast.
Yeah, it was straight out the blocks. He recognised he'd got that badly wrong, and it was a whole hands up apology. This was no kind of, I'll apologise if somebody maybe thought they might have been offended somewhere. This was, I'm sorry, I got it wrong. I shouldn't have said that. I'm really sorry. I won't do it again. But interestingly, Rachel Reeves herself actually says something quite similar.
Yeah, and the thing is with this is that clearly, as he's acknowledged, the comparison with pocket money, it sort of sounds trivializing. And so but actually, if you're trying, communicating in pictures is a good idea, and vivid imagery is a good idea, and as an explanation for the gap, as he was trying to illustrate, between the projection and what he hopes for to be the reality for someone going into work. It works as an analogy. It's just a crude comparison.
Well,
isn't it?
and also, I think Darren Jones typically is thought of as one of the government's better communicators and somebody who normally has a big grasp of detail. And he's quite often sent out on these kind of days to explain complicated policy and what they think is an accessible, understandable way. But I think the particular problem with this wasn't just the clumsy and potentially offensive analogy of pocket money, but also something we can give and take away relatively easily. But also the fact that there is a sense from some of the Labour benches that the way these welfare reforms have been worked out is by studying the numbers and the spreadsheets and the book and moving figures around. And actually, what then it becomes easy to forget is the people at the end of all this. Now, the government, I'm sure, would push back quite hard on that because they're clearly saying that they think that this is about helping people back into work and making the moral case for it. But there is undoubtedly some people that think perhaps this has been a bit too much of a number crunching exercise. And that, from Darren Jones, allowed that kind of feeling to develop in some quarters.
And the people who've been making that case got a bit of ammo today from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the think tank, who stay up all night crunching all the numbers and then do a presentation the next day of their take on it. And Faisal, you were watching that presentation, and actually the IFS said, yeah, the fact that the government had to come back for some further welfare savings suggests that they wanted to make the numbers add up rather than they were on some kind of moral crusade to make a better benefit system. And also back to this thing we were talking about, the headroom. The fact that the headroom now, the wriggle room, the buffer zone is precisely the same as what it was when Rachel Reeves did the budget in the autumn. Adds to that whole feel that this was an Excel exercise rather than doing something excellent.
And so the question would be, in a slightly alternative universe where they decided what is the right welfare reform that will inevitably yield us lower benefit costs and is good, would we have done this exactly the same way? Would we have chosen to do it like this? And I think the thing that I was sort of quietly concerning from the IFS was that they spotted and very clearly said, and maybe it was Richard Hughes too, that the billion
budget responsibility.
the £1 billion that's gone in to support the Saturday morning job, as Darren Jones put in his analogy, they haven't really explained what that is. So how can we even analyse how it's going to work? And it's a bigger issue here, which is the government, in making these welfare reforms and at the Spring Statement, were unwilling really to say head on what I think they think and what they're trying to achieve. And we've talked about this before, which is they are very worried that there's a social trend of a significant rise in youth mental health related incapacity and inactivity, and they want to roll it back.
And yet this then got caught up in this sequencing around a statement where there is a political desire to maintain the wiggle room, and then you've got a scenario where the Work and Pension Secretary is having an internal discussion around how much money she can prize out of the Treasury and how it'll be spent around helping people into work. You then get the majority of the policy announced, but you don't get the impact assessment because the argument is that has to wait for the statement because of the information that's coming from the Office for Budget Responsibility. And then you get playing out publicly this crunch around, the numbers don't quite up to get to the exact decimal point around the wiggle room. And therefore, you've got to do this additional stuff around the health element of universal credit.
And also then when the government is defending not publishing the impact statement alongside the actual reforms, they deny it's because the impact statement looks bad. And then the impact statement is published and it suggests that 250,000 extra people will be in poverty as a result of the reforms, which sounds like maybe they didn't want to publish it on the day.
And but that news then sits alongside all of the other stuff because it's come on a big day of other broader economic arguments, as opposed to in the same telling of the story, the news story. It sounds quite crude putting it like that. When the welfare package was announced last week.
Also, the story about the welfare reforms, I mean, this is just, we're in the foothills of it now because actually it requires quite a lot of implementation. So there's lots of opportunities for charities, campaigners, people who receive these benefits themselves, Labour MPs, to get very angry about it and cause a problem for the government.
Yeah, none of this is coming in straight away. I think that's also important to note for the people that are currently receiving one of these benefits who might be really worried that suddenly next week they're not going to get it. I mean, there's definitely a time lag on some of this. Some of it is out to consultation. So there will be that opportunity for comment. And we also are expecting there's going to be a vote in the House of Commons on this, because some of it's going to have to require legislation that will need Labour MPs to back it. And interestingly, during the course of Thursday, there have already been, I would say, a very slow and definitely a drip, as opposed to anything else, but of Labour MPs saying, actually, I don't think I can back this. And what is fascinating about the politics of this is, yes, of course, it's always going to be difficult for a Labour government to make the case for cutting down on welfare and support payments to including some really vulnerable people. Politically, that would always be difficult. But I think when you speak to some of the people that say they can't back this at the moment, they accept that there might be a need to look at the issue that you raised, Faisal, about this growing number of particularly young working age people who are going straight from education onto welfare, because they want these people to have all of the right life chances and opportunities. That in and of itself, they would accept and support. But it is about the choreography. It is about the way this has been done. It is about the fact that there is a feeling that this is a budgeting exercise as opposed to an exercise in genuine welfare reform. And therefore, what are the potential consequences to some of the most vulnerable? I think that is where some of the opposition is coming from. Although I would caveat with saying, there are others on the Labour benches that think it is absolutely right to get a grip of this and tackle this, and this is necessary. And it's quite, I don't know where you're at, but I'm finding it quite hard to judge how big the kind of level of discontent is on the Labour benches at the moment.
There's a few muttering who are uncomfortable with it, and actually even those who.
I mean, Liz Kendall hasn't looked particularly comfortable at some points.
Well, I think, and I think some of all of this comes back to the sequencing again. That there hasn't been the space to make that wider argument. It has been caught up in the looking for pennies down the back of the Treasury sofa kind of stuff.
And they haven't been able to present the other side of the argument, which is look at all the support we can put in place and what that's going to do to people. And here's the Office of Budget Responsibilities assessment of that, because it hasn't been quite worked through yet, I think it's fair to say.
Some of the numbers that came out today, I think it was from the Resolution Foundation's assessment. I mean, we were saying, was it several, a few £1,000s to several 100,000 people. I mean, there are some groups where you lose universal credit and PIP and carers allowance, and you're looking at several thousand. Some not obscure groups like £10,000 if you include some of the things that are being consulted on. There's a specific quality to this reform that it's really concentrated, and therefore it'll be very visible, and therefore the behavioural impacts being done on the spreadsheets are extremely strong. So this is. I think that this is tricky. This is tricky, and it was basically the single biggest moving part yesterday. It was the only real policy that was being posted yesterday. So there's a big spotlight on this now for the next 6 months.
Although it's interesting that sort of how in this spreadsheety world we find ourselves in now, that all the observers and the OBR and the think tanks like the Resolution Foundation talk about people losing from this reform. But some of the people they're talking about are people who haven't even applied to get the benefit in the first place.
Potential future recipients.
Because they've changed the criteria for people who might apply for it in 3 years' time. So is that somebody who's really losing? To be discussed.
Yeah, and also
I'm sure an economist would say, yeah, they are.
No, but the other point to note on that is that all those think tanky people that crunch the numbers, including the Institute for Fiscal Studies today, are making the point it's actually really hard to predict what you'll actually get from this in terms of savings, because they look at the numbers, because typically when they've attempted some of these welfare reforms in the past, what they've predicted as to might be the saving from it is wildly inaccurate because of the potential behavioural changes that you mentioned, Faisal. And the Institute for Fiscal Studies was making that point again today, right? That actually we don't know if the numbers on the spreadsheet, which is what a lot of this is at the moment because it hasn't come in yet and it hasn't started to filter through yet, are actually even going to be quite what you think they are around this stuff, because it's complex and it's tricky and it involves people.
In other news, we got a blast from the past in the House of Lords today. It was the first speech, the maiden speech by Lady Gray, who, as Sue Gray, carried out the Partygate report into the Whitehall parties during COVID, and then was Keir Starmer's chief of staff, which wasn't a particularly happy time for her. And she made a little reference to losing her job because it was in a debate about employment rights. But then she had this warning for Keir Starmer and others about how they talk about the civil service and what effect some of the language has on the people who work in the government departments.
When we hear the phrases of blobs, pen pushers, axes, chainsaws and other implements, they hear it too. Yeah. Difficult decisions are needed, of course, and the civil service will be keen to be part of any reform journey. But we need them and other public servants to succeed. I will continue to support a progressive civil service. I hope others will do the same. Thank you.
Lady Gray's, that's a kind of tea, isn't it? Is that right? Am I making it up?
Oh, no, that would be that'd be a
No, but I think
No, you're right. No, you're right. You're absolutely
Lady
right.
Grey. I
You are
think
right.
you're
Yeah,
right.
you are.
drinker, I don't know.
Yeah.
No, I
No,
mean,
it's
yeah.
Not Yorkshire.
It's a
though, is it?
derivation.
No, it's not.
Oh, this is like when we used to
Dark
work in the same offices today in Parliament. I miss those days.
It's not the real deal.
But Chris, aside from
Yeah.
the fact that we're actually now hearing Sue Gray, and for lots of people, that's the first time we've ever heard the voice of this quite famous person. But her point there about how this government talks about the civil service. Okay, their anger, their rhetorical anger, kind of waxes and wanes. Like Keir Starmer says like negative things and then walks it back because he's offended civil servants. The language changes, but I feel the level of frustration from Labour people with the civil service sort of stays the same, like quite medium to high.
Yeah, and I think what's been interesting about Labour's, and this is their public outlook on the civil service, is how quickly it went from 0 to 60. Considering they've not been in power for a year yet. And, we had all of the stuff with the previous government around some of the language we heard Baroness Gray using there. But we've had similar stuff, perhaps not expressed quite as bluntly as some others did before. But we've had it from Keir Starmer. It was interesting actually hearing a broader part of that maiden speech from Sue Gray. That she injected a bit of humour around what was for her personally a really, really difficult time, becoming a public figure because of the report she'd done into Partygate, the lightning rod that she was within the Labour Party, both in opposition and then in those early months in government, and how brutal, frankly, her removal from Downing Street was, the briefing to journalists, me included, that contributed towards all of that. It'd be fascinating to see what role she plays in what is now in public life, as opposed to a...
Is she taking Labour whip? Or
Yeah. I think
right.
so. Is that's right? I should
Well, she was saying surrounded
Yes,
by other Labour peers.
Yes, I'm pretty... You know what? I've just said yes, and I'm going to check.
Because normally,
Well, hopefully
normally
she's listening, and then
because normally, if you'd gone straight
us.
from the civil service, you'd have been across.
Normally,
typically
yes.
across pension.
But of course, she had a sort of political job on the way.
Yeah.
But Alex, forget like rhetoric about civil servants and like calling them a blob or getting a chainsaw. There's actually going to be some actual quite serious action with the civil service, because the story about the spring statement a few days before was that they're going to cut the headcount of civil servants.
Yeah,
like something
considerably.
like by 15%, which is
Yeah,
a lot of people.
Yeah, so and the estimate is around 10,000 civil servants potentially, but it's 15% in government running costs. And I think it's quite important to distinguish between what they don't seem to be talking about here is the sort of what some people call the frontline civil servants. They're talking about the people that are involved in the operation of government. So that's where they're going to cut, they claim, 15%.
Quick double check, fact check. She is a Labour peer.
That is interesting.
I thought I was right, but
Yeah.
probably
I'm sorry,
Lady
I
Gray a
apologize.
tea? Or did you only find out one thing in that?
Yeah, sorry, hang on. a
Oh,
minute.
right. Some news hound you are.
Well, maybe I'll put it into an AI. Put it into Grok. Hang on, is Lady
And her son's an MP.
Liam Conlon? Yeah. Gray. Now.
This
I've
is
got a dilemma
fascinating
here.
television,
I've got
watching Chris just
I've
type
got a dilemma
looking up
here.
things on
Do
the internet.
I spelt grey as if it was Sue Gray rather than grey as in the colour, which I think is how the tea is spelt. A tea. Right, here we go.
Well, I feel
Holding my breath.
I feel we have
This is like the Oscars.
spilt enough
Yes,
tea, as they say
it
on
is.
TikTok. Oh, right, okay, good.
Lady Grey is a type of tea. It's a variation of the classic Earl Grey tea,
There you go.
which is
think I said
traditionally
that about 10
flavoured with
I think you might.
flavoured with bergamot.
Anyway,
We've had
many
enough.
people will be
We've had enough.
consuming this episode of Newscast late at night on television, and you do not want a caffeinated drink just before bed.
Not even a
But if
bit
you're
of
listening
ice.
to the podcast edition of this at a time which would suit a strong cup of tea or coffee, then we hope you've enjoyed it as much as listening to our waffling. Love to see you guys. We've run out of wriggle room. That's it. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Good things come to